Welcome to Opera Holland Park on Saturday, July the 17th, between 2 and 4 in the afternoon. We'll be bringing you the first ever Word in Your Park from this very pleasant, airy, covered but socially distanced auditorium.
No, Word in Your Park is going to be a weatherproof event. We're under canvas, but we have taken the precaution of booking 2 hours of blistering sunshine just in case, and it's going to be us and some old pals of ours involved in 2 hours of rock and roll storytelling, involving Gary Crowley, Leslie Ann Jones, Barney Hoskins, and others to be announced. There'll be mood-altering drinks available, and who knows, crisps.
It's been a long, cold, lonely winter, so it'll be good to see you here. Get your tickets at the link below. See you there.
Word in Your Attic, a Zoom with a view.
Well, welcome to another Word in Your Attic, and what a joy to be joined by someone we haven't seen for years, actually, the music writer and author and former guiding light at VH1 and MTV, and currently the host of, among other things, the superbly titled Sirius radio show Flanagan's Wake. But of course,
very good.
Oh yes, it's Bill Flanagan. Bill, it's lovely to see you. Terrific.
Thank you. It's great. It's great to see you too. I see your bylines in your work, so I don't realize how that it's actually been 50 years since we've had a together.
It's been a while.
It's been quite a while. Where are you, Bill? Tell us where you are.
I am in rural Connecticut, and I have had this house for quite a while. And during COVID, this became the safe place to be. I was just sort of go into the city like a post-apocalyptic movie to pick up my mail and make sure my water's running. Occasionally it'll be something like the smoke alarm will go off in the middle of the night, and an angry neighbor will call me, and I'll have to get in the car and drive 2 hours.
Oh, really? Yeah, it's quite a long way, is it, to drive?
It's 2 hours. Yeah.
Good grief! That's
what a lovely
That's
excuse.
a suburb. That's a suburb in American terms. 2 hours. If you go 2 hours in the UK, you drop off the side of the country. It doesn't happen.
No, it's always something that confused Americans, because we'd hear the Beatles talk about, for people in London, Liverpool, and we thought it was like Alabama or something.
Yeah.
We thought, well, how many days did it take you to drive?
But how lovely to be marooned in Connecticut for all that time. Must be nice, wasn't it?
It was actually pretty nice, and I had we have a lot of space here, and we have a big guest house, and so my daughter and her husband spent their pregnancy here during COVID, and the baby was born.
Oh, wonderful.
Oh, very good.
And my son and my other daughter were pretty much here most of the time, so it was kind of like the Waltons.
Yeah, well, this is. I think there's been a lot of this going on during, for people who are fortunately placed during the pandemic. I've overheard loads of conversations over the garden wall with next door neighbors, with all their children gathered, all their children in their 20s and 30s gathered, and I thought, this would not be happening.
Would not happen
if it weren't for this. They'd be
like
off
John
road their own lives.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
it's amazing. And it's also kind of a slow re-entry for me. I mean, some people, including my kids, are just like, great, I'm going to a restaurant, I'm going to a concert, I'm going to a ball game, hand me my mask and give me a shot if I need it. Whereas I'm having a much slower re-entry, as lack of a haircut shows. I'm kind of reluctant to fully re-engage with the full New York schedule.
I'm afraid we're a bit guilty of this too, actually, with our terrible stubble.
Well, it's hostage. It always looks like a hostage video. This does. So, Bill, we traditionally start these conversations with asking people if they can remember what record-playing machinery was in your home when you were a child.
Oh, that's interesting. Well, it's interesting to me. It may not be interesting to anyone else. When I was probably about 5 or 6 years old, my brother and I shared a bedroom, and my father lugged in from the horse barn where it had been stored, a big, huge 1930s, I guess, radio, with the big knobs. I mean, it was the size of a Saturn rocket booster, and a flip top that you lifted up, and it played 78s.
Oh, right. The record player in the top.
Record player in the top. And he gave me that and a bunch of old 78s that were mainly sort of Irish party songs. Who Threw the Overalls and Mrs. Murphy's Chowder.
Say that again. Who threw what?
Who Threw the Overalls and Mrs. Murphy's Chowder. Nobody spoke, so they shouted all the louder. It's an Irish trick, that's true. I can lick the mick that threw the overalls in Mrs. Murphy's chowder. And uphill from there.
Really had a big impression on you. That's fantastic.
That's clearly Boston Irish, isn't it? Is that right?
Oh yeah, you know, these are songs written for an audience who have never set foot in the real Ireland. But of course the radio tuned in, and you know, my brother and I started listening to Jan and Dean and you know, early 60s, late Elvis and the Beach Boys when they came along. And that is the device upon which the Beatles entered our lives.
Right.
And everything went.
Where were you? Was it, I can't try to remember, was it Rhode Island that you grew up? Yeah. And so the Beatles.
Did you ever, I've got to ask this question because you may not be old enough, but you know, you hear stories about Robbie Robertson, people like that, being able to pick up stations broadcasting from Louisiana way up in Canada because of the strange effects of the atmosphere. Did you ever have any experience of that?
People tell those stories, but I never experienced that.
Right.
I experienced that a little bit when we'd go on vacation in the summers in the mountains of Maine, because especially after 6 o'clock, when a lot of the local radio turned off, there was nothing interfering with the wavelength. So you would get these strange faraway stations. But in Rhode Island, there was so much static.
Other stuff, yeah.
There were lots of Rhode Island stations. There were the Boston stations. There were the Connecticut stations. If you picked it right, you could get the New York stations. So there was no chance for Mexican border radio.
How romantic.
That's the kind of Wolfman Jack romantic version of it, isn't it? That's
romantic.
Right. Massive
and I always
booster.
wonder, because you hear people tell those stories, and it's like, yeah, I'd listen to Singapore when I was.
Yeah.
So tell us how the Beatles entered your life. Can you remember that?
Well, sure. Like all Americans, it was the Ed Sullivan Show. It was that February night in 1964 when I was fighting with my brother and sister because I wanted to watch on the competing channel Patrick McGowan as Dr. Sin in The Scarecrow of Romney Marsh, and we reached a compromise that we would watch when the Beatles came on. We would watch the Beatles, and then when it became the Jugglers and the Elephant Act, we would switch over to the Scarecrow of Romney Marsh. And both the Beatles and the Scarecrow of Romney Marsh run for 3 weeks in a row. So there was some counter programming by Walt Disney. But you know, like everybody, once I saw the Beatles, I was sold. And then through that, you know, Jules Verne radio, of course, everything was Beatles all the time. You know,
right?
It was amazing. You know, on the Beatles radio show that I do. In America, I've talked to a lot of people from Neil Sedaka to, you know, you name it, Pat Boone, who've all talked about how they were just in the middle of a huge career. In February of 1964, it stopped.
Just pulled the rug out from under them. Absolutely.
There's a wonderful quote from Jerry Lee Lewis, I think it is. He said, America had loads of solo singers, all called Bobby Rydell, Bobby V. Right. And he said the Beatles, I think the expression he uses is he cut them all down like wheat before a sickle. The whole lot.
Leave it to the killer to find an appropriately violent metaphor.
Absolutely. Perfect. Now, all these guys in sweaters, you know, they just went, didn't they?
They went. They were gone. They were gone in no time.
Because so much of it, what fascinates me is so much of it was stylistic, wasn't it? As well as musical. It was the fact that they looked different.
Well, they looked like they were from another planet. I mean, people assumed they were wearing wigs, you know, because men's hair could not grow that long. Everyone had a different effect. But, you know, it was the whole thing. Remember, you know, you guys saw the Beatles from the end of 1962. So you saw them kind of evolve from those slightly awkward hair forward look on the Please Please.
No, you got the polished package that really worked.
A hard day's night, perfectly polished, media savvy, a wisecrack for every situation, high-mind, four-headed monster. And you know, and also we thought the Beatles put out a new album every few weeks because Capitol Records
they did
chopped up the British albums. And so, you know, you got everything from the end of 62 to February of 64 that went from 14 songs on an LP to 10 or 11 or maybe 12 in the United States. So that in no time at all, we got Introducing the Beatles, Meet the Beatles second album, something new, as well as kind of bogus things like
bogus.
Yeah.
So you know, it was just an avalanche. You could have you know, by the end of 1964, there were 10 Beatles LPs out in the United States.
And the other kind of revolution was that there weren't that many bands, were there, in America? There was sort of Buddy Holly had a band, but you didn't think of him as a band. Elvis Presley had a band.
The Beach Boys were a band.
Yeah.
You know, and of course, the Supremes and the Temptations and the Motown groups were groups. They were singing.
Yeah.
But the idea of the Beatles, a group that played their own instruments, sang their own songs, wrote their own songs, was pretty revolutionary.
Yeah.
Because we you know, all those interviews we read with people like Tom Petty and all the members of the Byrds, the whole thing was they saw that and they thought, we got to form a band. We've got to be in a gang. You know, that was the real driver, wasn't it?
Yeah, and that's also, you know, a really attractive thing to a kid.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, the notion that me and my buddies, you know, that's the basis of everything from the popularity of Friends to the popularity of Facebook pictures of me and my gang.
Yes.
It's a real powerful thing, I think, for children and adolescents. And
So
you know, it's also probably why we, even at our advanced age, we hate it when bands hate each other. You know, I was just listening to interviews with Crosby, Stills and Nash promoting the anniversary of Deja Vu, and you know, you still get that little dagger in your heart when Crosby says the others won't speak to him, and Nash says, "I love David, but I never want to see him again." You know.
No, it's true.
It's so true. You want them to be living in Hard Day's Night.
No, but whether you want that or not, if you go and see any band like that live in their 50s, 60s, 70s, whatever, half the value is just seeing them walk on the stage and thinking, there they are. There's my childhood.
You know who said that almost exactly to me on a couple of occasions?
Go on.
Bono.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he says that people he can feel the air in the room change when the four of them walk on stage together.
Yeah. It's just that moment. So tell us about, where did you buy records? Can you remember your early purchases? Have you still kept them?
I have kept them, although I apologize. My very first records are somewhere between Rhode Island, New York, and Connecticut.
Of course.
But I couldn't put my hands on them in time for this.
Can you remember the first singles you bought?
The first record I bought, my brother and I chipped in to buy the Beatles' second album.
Yeah.
Which is roughly equivalent to With the Beatles, I think. It's a real rock and roll record. It's got Roll Over Beethoven and I don't think it has, I think it has Long Tall Sally. It's
Twist
30
and
minutes.
Shout, probably, yeah.
Yes, it has Twist and Shout.
Yeah.
It's just 30 minutes of no, actually, I think Twist and Shout is on Meet the Beatles. But now I'm going to lose my job on the Beatles channel. But you know, it's a constant, it's like translating into a different language. It's so confusing for those of us who bought all the Beatles records in the 60s to deal with the post-CD era British versions of the
Absolutely.
Beatles. You know,
it's like changing currency.
My instinct is, it is like changing currency. My instinct is still to say, you know, oh, that was on Beatles 65.
Right.
And you know, I don't just get a blank look from friends in the UK. I get a blank look from anyone under the age of 45.
I suppose, because they
don't exist, do they?
Because that's the thing we find, and we've found in quite a number of these conversations, whenever the subject of the Beatles comes up, particularly with somebody under the age of 60 or whatever, they came to the Beatles, kids, whippersnappers, they came to the Beatles in the wrong order, so to speak.
Yeah, that's
you know what I mean? They came to it via the Red and the Blue albums or the Anthology or God knows what, you know.
Here Comes the Sun, the biggest streaming track on Spotify. You know, that's where they start and they work back.
I've talked on Beatles radio to several artists who say, well, when I was a kid, my family had Beatles 1, which is astonishing to me.
Right. That's the number one's 27 singles. That's right.
Yeah.
That came out, about 15 years ago?
20 years ago, I guess. But, but that's the astonishing thing, is to go, well, if you were 5 years old when that came out, you're 25 now and you're making pop records.
Right. Were you ever in a band or anything like that?
Well, you know, we thought we were. I think I was talking to some of the guys who were in the band not long ago, and I said, looking back, it was really a club, which kind of goes back to what you were saying about the appeal of the Beatles being that they were a gang. I was in a couple of bands when I was in my late teens and early 20s, but really they were exercises in writing songs and making recordings and sending them out to record companies, thinking we could become Steely Dan.
Right.
And periodically we would say, we got to go play some shows, and we'd go play some gigs, and then we'd get in fist fights and break up for a while and then slowly get back together again. So it wasn't like my friends who really played in bands had a truck and a PA and a sound man, and they worked 6 nights a week.
You're right. There were lots of friends of mine who were in those kind of bands who thought they wanted to be Steely Dan, precisely that. And they never played a gig, so they thought that they had that the world would just beat a path to their door, and they would be somehow discovered.
Obviously, you pick some terrible record and you'd go, well, if that can get a record deal, then certainly I can get a record deal.
Absolutely. Without realizing you've got to go out and make yourself known.
So, okay, if you set your sights on being Steely Dan, how far off Steely Dan standard were you? Because, thinking you be Steely Dan it's setting your aim quite high, isn't it?
Well, I should say, I think, we thought we'd be Steely Dan in the sense, after a certain point, they were various, and they put out records. You didn't particularly know what they looked like. Right. And they didn't tour, and they didn't go on TV. So it was this almost the idea of making records like being a novelist, that you just sort of stay in your mansion and occasionally send out a dispatch to the world.
That's a very good description. And they didn't really advertise what they looked like because, they weren't the most charismatic pair on stage, were they?
Yeah, and that worked pretty well for them.
It did.
And started. I did see them play when they started out, and they were great when they were a 5-piece rock band. But then they just became sort of a concept for Becker and Fagan, and that seemed like a night. But at that time, a lot of people did that. Randy Newman almost never toured. It was actually, and this started the Beatles and Dylan in '66, saying the revolutionary thing that I'm not going to tour anymore. You go, well, how is that possible? That's like saying I'm a juggler, but I'm not going to use any balls.
Yeah.
And it reinvented the idea of what a rock and roller might be, that it might be a job like being a filmmaker or being a novelist or a poet.
Yeah.
And that lasted for a lot of the 70s, and then people realized, got to get on the road and make some money.
When do you remember the first act you ever saw?
Oh, yeah. It was in 1969. It was at the Rhode Island Auditorium in Providence. It was Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, the Carter family.
Fantastic. Christ, that's amazing.
And I was so excited. I went out and bought the little known between
there's songs
Lord.
Folsom Prison and San Quentin.
Which is a weird album. It's got a load of speech bands on it where he just talks about being in the Holy Land.
In the Holy Land. And I wish you could see that this is a 3D cover.
Oh, God.
I've kept a bit of the plastic on it to preserve the 3D from scratches. Now, it didn't fail to, it came to my attention at the time that the 2 3D covers were Satanic Majesties.
Yep.
In the Holy Land. You really had Saturday night and Sunday morning in 3D.
Oh, that's good.
As a whole part of Johnny Cash that history has just whitewashed out of the legend of Johnny Cash, isn't it?
Yeah, the legend of Johnny Cash is pretty adaptable.
Yes.
People on the right, people on the left, Native Americans, everybody's got their own Johnny Cash.
Yeah.
And that I suppose everybody has their own Mark Twain too. So
right, okay.
More power to him. I got to in 1988. I went on the road with Cash for about 5 days or something on a tour of the South, and that was a moment when he was sort of at a real low. He'd been dropped by Columbia. And it was just a great experience to travel with him and watch him do different kinds of shows in North Carolina and Virginia, do matinees, and have breakfast with John and June, and meet their friends who were every kind. Sanford Meisner came and had a meal with us once.
Who's that? Go
The
on.
great acting coach. He was sort of
Okay.
one of the great legendary teachers of the, I don't know, James Dean and Montgomery Clift and stuff. So that gave me a different perspective on Cash.
So is that the kind of circuit? It's quite interesting. This is that the kind of circuit that that Bob Dylan probably plays a lot of. That if you in America, if you don't play New York, Los Angeles, the major cities, that's the kind of thing you play, isn't it? You play wherever there is a crowd.
At that time, Cash was on a somewhat different circuit from what I think Dylan would go on. I think Dylan would still be on a place where he would be playing to the Dylan audience. Cash was in some places playing to kind of a general people who might have gone to see, I don't know, the Carpenters one week, kind of rotating musical theater type things, where you might be a comedian and then something else, a sort of a Branford, Missouri on a spread out across the map. And his business was down. And it was interesting to me because that's who Cash was playing for in the South. I would see him when he came to New York or when he came to Boston. And then he'd be playing to a hip crowd.
I was going to say really hip, kind of left-wing crowd. Yes.
Yeah. And in New York and Boston, he would play songs from Sun Records and stuff. He knew the audience. Whereas down in Virginia and North Carolina at that time, he was playing joke songs and novelty songs and one piece at a time, and June would tell jokes. So, it was a different side of Johnny Cash.
Yeah. When did you start writing about music?
1975. I was 20 years old, and I had figured out a few years before that security was pretty lax at a lot of rock concerts. Not the big names, but, when Jackson Browne would come to town before he had a hit, or someone like that, Bonnie Raitt, you could kind of walk backstage and talk to them. And in those sort of hippie days, that was considered perfectly legitimate. Nobody called security to kick you out. And I remember thinking, gee, I should start bringing a tape recorder because I'm having some pretty interesting conversations with some of these people. And I was a big fan of Bruce Springsteen when he was still pretty local. I was at that show that John Landau wrote, I've Seen the Future of Rock and Roll.
Oh, right, you were there.
Wonderful.
Okay,
yeah. And I was aware, I remember the first time I saw Springsteen in early 74, I said to a kid I knew coming out of the show, that's like seeing the Beatles in Liverpool. That's like seeing Elvis at the Louisiana Hayride. This guy is going to be, for our generation, the guy. And the guy I said that to said, are you nuts? What are you talking about? The idea was he was sort of, he was described as either a Van Morrison imitator sometimes, or he's pretty good. He's like the Jay Giles band, but not as good. Which, are not totally erroneous connections, but so I love Springsteen. I saw him all I could. And I thought in the summer of 75, when this new album comes out, which was Born to Run, when this new album comes out, there's not going to be any getting close to him. There's not going to be any walking backstage. So I just decided I was going to go interview him. And I got a friend with a camera. I said, come along and take some pictures. We bought tickets for the show. It turned out to be the day he finished Born to Run. He told me years later that he had finished Born to Run that morning. And then they got in the van and came to Providence. And I went down to the theater in the afternoon to just poke around. He wasn't there, of course, but I saw that the road crew were wearing backstage passes with a picture from an ad in the paper of Bruce standing looking through a window. So I went home, I cut the ad out of the paper, I put glue on it, I taped it to my pants leg. I got my tape recorder, we went to the show, he was fantastic. I went backstage, they stopped me, I showed them my pass, they let me in. Bruce was in the shower, I sat down in the room and interviewed the whole E Street Band. Bruce came out of the shower, I interviewed Bruce.
So you just simply said, look, did you tell them who you were writing for? Or
I had no assignment. I wasn't writing for
anyone.
anybody.
So they didn't mind, you just said, I've got a tape recorder, I'm going to interview you.
Yeah.
And isn't that astonishing?
It's pretty astonishing.
Yeah.
It was Steve Van Zant's first show with the E Street Band. I mean, he had a long history with Bruce, but this was when he joined the E Street Band.
But they were still probably at the stage where they were grateful for attention. Presumably, they were
good use of time.
National newspapers weren't
again, as I say about meeting Jackson, and I met Jimmy Buffett when he was playing small places because my friend and I snuck backstage while we thought he was on stage to eat his buffet.
He's his rider.
He walked in and caught us. And we've been friends ever since.
So where did your Springsteen interview get published?
Loose. It was very loose. The Springsteen piece.
Where did it appear?
I sold to, well, I didn't sell because I didn't get paid. I put it in an underground paper called Fresh Fruit, which for whom I would go on to interview the Ramones when their first album came out and the Talking Heads before their first album came out.
So your first interview was Bruce Springsteen.
Yes.
That's quite good.
And the second one sounds like it was the Ramones.
We talked to Robin Denslow recently on one of these. Robin wrote about folk music for The Guardian for years. And his first interview was Bob Dylan at the Savoy.
There's always somebody who can top you.
Yeah.
And he kind of blagged his way in, very similar to the to the way you did it.
Tell us about interviewing the Ramones. That was before the album came out. So
the Ramones was right when the album came out.
So they thought the whole act had come together. The four kind of cartoon characters. Yeah.
The thing about the Ramones was I was working in a record store and the promo of that album came in before the actual album did, and I took it home and listened to it. And I had all my friends would come over and we'd all sit and we'd go, so are they serious?
We've had this conversation a million times. People thought it was novelty.
It was a comedy record.
Yeah, it was a comedy record. Beat on the brat with a baseball bat. Oh yeah, So we saw that the Ramones were going to play not even in a regular place that national bands played. It was a fisherman's bar in Newport.
Oh, lovely.
Up a flight of stairs over a store. And so my friends and I said, well, let's go. So we drove down and saw 2 sets by the Ramones. There were 3 small groups of people there, about a group of about 6 that I came with, a group of about 6 kids, probably from RISD, who were probably from New York and were hip to CBGBs and punk rock and were dressed appropriately. And about 8 guys sitting at the bar with the hockey game with the sound turned down, drinking beer and going, what's going on over there? And that was it. And similar to Springsteen, when it was over, I said to the guys, just wait for me. And I had a tape recorder and I walked in the dressing room and I knocked on the door and I said, hey, can I? And they were sitting there before the show began. It's not like they were hiding from the fans. There were no fans. They were just sitting looking Ramonesy against the wall. So I did an interview with them and then brought it back. So, and Talking Heads, you see, these were just things I was interested in doing out of my own curiosity. I didn't think of it as a job. And as I say, I don't think I got paid anything on those early stories. It was just sort of an excuse to meet these guys and answer my own curiosity. And then some of the guys at Fresh Fruit went to work for another paper called Grassroots, which was a little more at least they theoretically paid people. And they called me one morning and said, you got to go up to RISD right now. The Talking Heads are waiting to talk to you. And I had seen them. They played at RISD and I had seen them play. But I said, I don't want to, I don't have anything to talk to them about. And they just cajoled me. And in fact, they had Chris France call me at home. And I said, okay, well, I don't want to be rude.
To beg you to interview them.
So, I mean, there really was a tremendous bit of being in the right place at the right time.
Yeah, sure.
Have you reminded them of that since? You must have seen the Talking Heads.
No, I would be mortified to realize I was the completely unprepared guy who came and asked them what kind of, did they think they'd get a record deal? Did they regret leaving Providence?
So since then, in your distinguished career, you've interviewed everybody. I think it's fair to say.
Yeah.
What have you learned about interviewing people? What would you pass on to your children, whatever, if they were ever planning to go into the same game?
If they were ever going into that lucrative enterprise. Well, I think that the most important thing, if you're interviewing musicians, is to base your questions on their music. To just sit down, no matter how well you think sit down with a pad in your lap and listen to the albums in sequence and look for things that recur, that pop out. Don't base interviews on reading other people's interviews. Don't base your interviews on press releases. Don't ask them to repeat stories that you already know the answers to. Now that's for print, you know.
Yeah,
I mean,
no, sure.
Yeah.
That's probably not true in doing a short television interview with someone. It's the opposite. If you're doing
It's completely the opposite.
Story.
A lot of the time, you're just going to trigger a story they've told a million times. Just get them to tell it slightly different.
Exactly. That's right.
What's your worst nightmare interviewing somebody?
What's my worst nightmare interviewing somebody? You know, I'm sure she would laugh about this and wouldn't mind me saying it. Chrissie Hynde can be the nicest person in the world, or she can be the professional Chrissie Hynde.
Yeah.
And I've always gotten along with her very well, and I think the world of her. I could not admire her more or like her more. But I got a call from Chrissie's manager 10 or 15 years ago saying, would you come down and do a talk with Chrissie at South by Southwest? And I said, sure.
Oh, you're in front of an audience.
In front of an audience.
That's a different game.
That becomes a point scoring exercise. You have to be put in your place.
So we were, we're backstage and we're talking, we're chatting, we're having fun. I brought my daughter because, we're just having a great time. Then we go on stage and Chrissie turns into the professional Chrissie Hynde.
This is it.
Based on Bob Dylan and Don't Look Back.
Yeah.
Yes.
And, it wasn't terrible, but I kind of thought, well, now do I engage? Do I start challenging her on whatever? Or do I just play my role and just kind of let her get the zingers in? So I thought, I'm just going to play my role. I don't want to. And then when we came off stage, she went right back to being
nicest part. But what you forget in those situations, that's happened to me several times, is that the audience are often really rooting for you, really feeling sympathetic and thinking, this is so unfair.
That's probably
this guy's asking a load of really curious and interesting questions,
Yeah, that's probably.
No, you have my sympathy. I've done a bit of that. And there are terrible stories. Who was it? The guy from Michael Hand from The Guardian, a terrible story that he had to do a thing with Ginger Baker, who was just worst in that.
One of mine worst too. Yeah.
That's going to be trouble going in.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Oh, yeah, that's one to avoid.
Who have you interviewed who was a massive surprise and turned out to be really revealing and fascinating, and you didn't think they would be?
Oh, let me think. There's, the terrible thing is I'm not sure which of the guys from the church it was, Martin Kilby or who's the other main guy in the church?
I honestly can't remember.
We don't know the church very well. No.
Yeah, Australian band.
Yeah.
It was about 6 months ago. He was booked on the Beatles radio show, and I thought, okay, I saw the church a couple of times, Australian sort of birdsy psychedelic band.
Yeah.
I liked them. And he turned out to be the most fascinating, insightful, thoughtful, deep thinker about music and rock and roll and the Beatles. So that was a delight. And I suppose that, I'm trying to think of anybody who was completely contrary to their image. Let's come back to that, because there's probably somebody who, one guy, I don't think I interviewed him. I think he was doing a TV show with, was Billy Idol, I remember, at the kind of the height of his fame. Was a very thoughtful guy who could quote speeches from Richard III and stuff.
Really? Yeah. But probably didn't like to do that too often because it was contrary to his image or whatever.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Don't you find? I find nowadays loads of interviews pop up with people on YouTube, and you think what you're seeing now is very often interviews with people 20 years after their success.
Sure.
And they're so much more candid. They say so much more. I was watching. What's the name of the guy from the Smashing Pumpkins?
Billy Corgan.
And who I have no interest in whatsoever. But I watched half an hour of an interview with him that he did recently, talking about the nightmare of being a rock star and falling out with all your mates and all that kind of stuff that he would never have talked about when it was happening.
Well, one thing I did sort of adapt as a technique when I was starting out, and it worked really well, was if I was sent to interview Ian Hunter about his new album, I didn't interview him about his new album. I interviewed him about his whole career.
Yeah.
And the artists would much rather talk about all their work than to just go into automatic pilot mode. And I found no magazine ever complained about it.
I'm sure.
The artists liked it more, and it was just a more interesting approach.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
I mean, everybody gets sick of. I've listened to a couple of interviews lately with one of my favorite artists, Annie Clark, St. Vincent, and you know, of course, she gets asked the same questions, and she gives more or less the same answers. And you know, you find yourself thinking, "Gee, why don't they just open the aperture a little bit?"
Yeah.
And not talk about the new work, but to bring in all the themes that have gone through all her work and are included in the new work.
You've interviewed Bob Dylan.
Yes.
How was that?
Great.
Right.
I mean, I am hesitant to say too much about it because you could fall out with Bob by talking about it too much. But the first time I interviewed Dylan was for my first book, Written in My Soul.
Oh, of course, yes.
And he was recording in New York, and I knew from Mark Knopfler, who I was friends with, that he was at, I think it was Record Plant, I don't remember, the studio he was at. So I went down to the studio and left a note and said, I'm writing a book of interviews with songwriters. Included is my interview with Van Morrison. Would love to talk to you about songwriting. Here's my phone number. And a couple of days later, his road manager called and said, okay, Bob says come by the hotel tomorrow. And we had a great interview, if I do say so. I mean, he was completely open. It ended because I ran out of stuff to ask him. And at the end, he just, hey, if you think of any more questions, call me.
But the interesting thing there is that that's the subject they very rarely get asked about, which they would love to talk about. You know, that's what people spend their entire lives doing, and all people want to talk to them about is their divorces and their financial situation and their drug problems and their court cases or whatever, and never ask them about things like songwriting. So I can see why that would have been very attractive.
That's the gig. That's what he does.
Yeah.
And you know, we had Dylan in the Jimmy Carter film recently, the documentary. So he came up here to this neighborhood, and we did it at my neighbor's house. And he talked about President Carter.
Tell us about that. So you've written the script, didn't you? It's a film called, is it Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President?
Why, it's Jimmy Carter, Rock and Roll President.
There it is.
Yeah, it's a documentary I did with my friends Mary Wharton and Chris Farrell about what to me was common knowledge, but apparently to most people is not, that when Carter came out of nowhere to run for president in 1976, he was friends with Dylan. He was close with Willie Nelson. His campaign was largely funded by concerts that the Allman Brothers and other Southern rockers did for him. And it's an exploration of his connection to music and musicians through his whole life, gospel music, jazz, and so on. And it was very important to President Carter that Dylan be in it. And I made a request to Jeff Rosen, Dylan's manager, who I know quite well. And he came back and said, no, Bob doesn't want to do it. You know, Bob doesn't do that kind of thing. And then President Carter just said, where's Dylan? Where is Dylan? So I went back and I said, look, I know this is not what Bob does, but it really means a lot to President Carter. So he said, okay.
Right.
I can distinctly remember the old grey whistle test on the British TV, and Bob Harris being at the Capricorn summer picnic.
All right.
In the I suppose it must have been maybe early 70s, and with the Allmans and all those guys, and Carter was there. And he interviewed him. Do you remember that, David? It was a real coup.
It was the first appearance of I think it was the first interview with Carter when he was running, I think, on British television.
Yeah,
that may be in this film.
It probably
it could well be,
but there is a British journalist interviewing him.
It'll be
it's
Bob
almost
Harris.
Certainly him.
It'll be Bob Harris.
Yeah, it was a very significant moment.
Yeah,
it all comes together.
Yeah.
So
what else you got there? I know you've dug out a few things, Bill, that you had to have with you.
I've dug out a few things. Well, now here's one, and again, like the 3D covers, this is not going to read on the screen. The monkey's head.
Oh goodness!
With the original reflective cover.
God, is that how it appeared in America? Is that? I didn't know that. I've never seen that before. Wow,
that's incredible.
And recently,
the monkey's it's funny because the monkey's head was quite a hip movie, wasn't it? Didn't Jack Nicholson write the script or something?
Jack Nicholson wrote it, and in recent years, it's become possible to look up who actually played on it. And among the musicians on those monkey songs on that album are Neil Young.
Yeah, isn't Frank Zappa on it?
Ry Cooder. Zappa's in the film.
Oh, right, okay.
Earl Palmer on drums.
Yeah,
It's amazing stuff. It's really great. It's a sort of a.
Because in Britain we had absolutely no idea about that at all. We just saw them as these kind of cartoon, television.
I remember the head being screened on television at some point, and people having no comprehension of what it was.
Yeah, it's a tough. It's a tough journey. If it had commercials, it would be intolerable. It's basically Rafelson and Snyder, who created were blowing up the Monkees' image. And of course, they were taking their Monkees' money and starting their own film company. And the first film they made was Easy Rider.
Yeah.
And after that, I think they lost the Monkees' phone number. They made 5 Easy Pieces.
5 Easy Pieces.
Yeah.
I love that film.
The King of Marvin Gardens. So they and Nicholson sort of took off. And, the Monkees were pretty important. If you're my age, if you were 11 years old when the Monkees came on TV, it was a little bit of a revitalization. And of course, it happened at the same moment that the Beatles were putting out Revolver and Eleanor Rigby and moving to another level.
Right. So that was getting a bit more difficult.
It was getting a little bit more difficult, and the Monkees kind of moved into the open slot.
Yeah. No, fair enough. So when you started writing, when did you move to New York?
I didn't move to New York till 1984.
Oh, right. Okay.
I was in Rhode Island. I would travel around to write and to do interviews. And I had a pretty regular gig with the Boston Globe. I would do concert reviews and record reviews and features for the Globe, probably 2 or 3 a week. So that sort of was my sustenance living. And then I would go to New York and write for the New York music magazines. Because I always wanted to get into New York. I didn't want to stay in New England, but I also didn't want to go to New York and have to get a day job. I wanted to sort of be established enough by the time I went there that I could have an apartment and make a living from writing.
Right.
So,
I think we first met when you were the editor-in-chief of the late lamented Musician.
At Musician magazine, that's right. And at one point there was some talk of EMAP, the company that had Mojo, buying. That's right. The Billboard company.
Yeah.
And we were going to combine forces. And we were going to Musician UK and Q USA. And, And I have to say, my old bosses at BPI, I think, pulled a fast one. I think they did a handshake deal with EMAP to do the thing. And I remember Sam Holsworth and I went over to London for the meetings and to have a celebratory glass of champagne. And then we went home, and the BPI guys switched over and did a deal with VNU, a Dutch company.
Right.
We nagged on their promise. The Dutch company wanted to pay more because they wanted the Billboard charts. They were a data gathering company.
Yeah.
So if not for that, we might have all been, sitting in a windowless newsroom today.
How would Q have done How would Q have done in America? I have no idea. Hard to imagine.
That was difficult to imagine.
Yeah.
So Musician, I mean, it was a treasury of fantastic old interviews and pieces, isn't it? I mean, has that all just disappeared? Does that it got an afterlife in a book?
Or it disappeared because the writers own the copyrights.
Yeah, this is it. Yes.
So so although there've been occasional attempts by different people involved to put Musician online or offer it, it always founders on the fact that you have to go to each writer and make a deal with him, and that's more than anyone wants to take on.
Yeah.
And in a way, I'm fine with that.
No, fine.
I kind of feel like these things they're journals. They're of their time, and if I wouldn't want to go online and read some snarky comment I made about Bob Seger, now, because good for Bob Seger, man. He's great. He's a very talented guy, but if you find an old issue of Musician in some antique store and you see that the snarky comment about Bob Seger is in the context of a magazine that has The Clash on the cover and an interview.
Absolutely.
Then, okay, you can understand where it's coming from. But in isolation, I don't think those things necessarily work.
No, I just would like to see these things more easily available as a kind of research tool, in libraries or whatever,
Right.
Because they are. I mean, literally, I know. I don't know what it's like in the United States, but in the UK, if you go to the British Library, which is the great national resource and it's fantastic, but the copies of the NME pre the 80s are falling apart, and they will just disappear to powder unless somebody does something about it, but doing something about it is incredibly expensive business to
it is
to preserve that stuff. And of course, one of the great things about magazines is the serendipity of seeing things next to other things, isn't it, on pages?
Exactly. I think
when you see it next to the adverts and
advertising.
It's the wider world. It's what was in the adverts. It was the movie that was big at the time. It was the president at the time. It's the news stories. That really makes it work. We've done quite a few things, actually. Dave and I just putting up old magazines and just digitally turning the pages and doing them as a kind of a crowd event. And that's a lot of fun, and that really works.
Yeah, just leafing through those things. So what else you got? What else you got there, Bill?
Yeah, more records.
Well, speaking of die cuts, speaking of reflective covers, speaking of 3D covers, I don't know if you had in the UK.
Oh yeah,
we did.
I've got that.
Oh yes, we did.
Yes.
With the cut covers and I probably wouldn't have this ridiculous haircut now if not for this cover. It was kind of like the Beatles are growing mustaches. We'll show them. The longest hair men have ever seen.
So that came out just after Brian Jones
after the death
died.
of Brian Jones, wasn't it? It was
Because
sort of done as a memorial.
It's got a little poem to
It's
Brian.
a poem. It reminds me.
Yeah.
Who wrote the poem? Is it Shelley? It's not
I think it
Shelley.
was Shelley.
Shelley is the one that he.
Shelley's what he read on stage at Hyde
That's what he
Park.
read
Park.
in Hyde Park. Oh,
I think it's on the back, isn't it?
Let's see it. Oh, it doesn't credit it. I guess
Oh, really?
You wrote it.
Oh,
When
well.
this you see, remember me. Yeah, speak of me as you find.
Right,
Well, who knows? Maybe Andrew Lou Goldham wrote it.
right.
Much more contemporary, but continuing our die
Oh, of course.
Oh yes.
with the pre-lawsuit cover.
I was going to say,
Oh,
yes.
yeah.
Now, tell us about that. It's Lucille Ball, wasn't it? Who?
Farrah Fawcett,
Farrah Fawcett.
Oh, really?
Raquel Welch.
Yeah, the Stones somehow didn't clear it with with the real women they were going to put in there, and they got hit with some lawsuits and had to withdraw it for a long
But
time.
that's extraordinary that they hadn't cleared that. If you think what happened to Sergeant
Somebody got docked a week's pay over that.
But Sergeant Pepper, they'd gone through the same thing and had to take various people off, didn't they?
Did they?
Yeah, I guess.
Well, I mean, obviously Adolf Hitler, but I mean, I think there was somebody else. There was an actor, a 1940s actor. I can't remember who it was now.
What do you mean they took it off?
Oh yeah, they're in the original artwork. The original artwork of Sergeant Pepper's got some other people on it who were taken out. Yep.
God, it's
About
amazing
3.
things Zappa got away with were only in it for the money. I mean, that had like Lee Harvey Oswald and stuff.
But you can see the kind of slapdash approach to sleeve design in that famous picture, famous letter that does around the internet on the internet that Mick Jagger sent to Andy Warhol.
Oh yeah.
To do that, I think it was pre-Sticky Fingers. I think it was something else, and it said, "Oh, just do what you like. We'll pay you $500 or whatever." It was completely,
I read a good story recently. I don't remember where, about Robert Frank doing Exile on Main Street.
Right.
And someone showed Mick a book of Robert Frank photos.
Yeah, they were. Yeah,
it's fantastic. We got to get this guy. Robert Frank was living in Maine or something, and we didn't have a telephone. And they flew him in, and he hung around with the Stones for a few days, and he never took any pictures. He just had a Super 8 movie camera. And finally, they just got tired of it and sent him home. Thought, well, that was a waste of money. And then he sent the Exile on Main Street art. He had picked up scraps of lyrics that Mick had left lying around. He had taken from the Super 8 images of the Stones that he shot and put them together with those kind of grotesque photos, the carnival photos, and made one of the greatest covers of all time.
it is absolutely
Incredible
fantastic cover.
Incredible.
Fantastic.
That's
cover.
so inspired.
Which of course we'd miss that kind of thing nowadays. What else you got there?
Well, I had another die cut. I just got on a die cut.
All right, go on.
Faces, long play.
Oh, long
Oh,
way
yes.
the faces, of course.
Yes, that's got a cover of Maybe I'm Amazed by Paul McCartney.
It does. I think.
Yeah.
Ronnie
The live
Lane-
version of it. Yeah.
Ronnie Lane sings the verses, and Rod sings the chorus. Now this.
Oh, they were fantastic in 1971. The Faces, my God. I remember seeing them at a festival. Rod booting footballs into the crowd, waving a bottle of Liebfrauen.
Summer '71 in Boston, outside in Boston Common. They showed up about 2 hours late because the Who were at the theater around the corner doing Tommy. And as they explained when they staggered on stage, they'd been drinking with the Who.
And everybody immediately forgave them because they thought, well, I'd love to be doing that too.
They played a fantastic set. They introduced Maggie May, and which Rod, depending on when he tells the story, they decided to release it as a single, either because of that reaction in Boston, or sometimes he says Cleveland. And when the concert was over, there was a huge anti-war demonstration going on, a march on the State House. So the crowd from the anti-war organizers were smart. They called the protest at the Boston Old State House for 11 p.m. so that the Who concert and the Faces concert were getting out at the same time. Greatly expanded the crowd of people marching. Of course, the Who and Faces fans didn't know they were marching against the war.
No, absolutely. I just thought it was taking them a while to get home.
Yeah.
Now this, I'd appreciate this as a public service request. I don't know if this was the same in the UK.
No, it was not the same in the UK. You used to be able to get it on import from the United States. But go on, carry on.
Well, here's the thing. This old 1968, I guess, Donovan's Greatest Hits, which is distinguishable from later pressings because it has a gatefold, and because it does not have Barabba, Jaggle, Atlantis, and Susan on the West Coast Waiting. It's before those songs came out. It has Mickey Most psychedelic Season of the Witch type remakes of Catch the Wind and Colors.
Oh, really?
Which to me are far superior
to the original.
The original folky Dylan imitation versions. But when, at some point in the life of this record, by the time it became this pressing, no gatefold sleeve, but otherwise apparently the same record, they had gone back and used the original hickory, folky Catch the Wind. So I have been trying for years to get good copies of the Mickey Most psychedelic Catch the Wind and Colors. And I even had friends who were putting this record out, who worked at Sony Legacy, who said, oh yeah, we'll get that for you. And then they couldn't find copies anywhere. So when I see a copy of the gatefold Donovan's Greatest Hits, I grab it because it contains, to me, the best versions of those songs. And
the fascinating thing about Mickey Most, I was always intrigued by Mickey Most, because I always found that if Mickey Most made a record with anybody, it was the best record they made. That was my experience. The Animals, the Jeff Beck group, Donovan, whoever, he did it better than anybody else. And yet none of those artists ever had a good word to say about him.
That's true.
Experience.
That's kind of fascinating, but not totally incomprehensible, because somebody could be, perhaps, I don't know Mickey Most, I never met him. Maybe he was a jerk in the studio. Maybe he ordered them around. Maybe he was bossy.
I'm sure he ordered them around.
But wasn't there an element of
time eating pizza and talking on the phone, reading the paper? But not.
But also, he was never hip, wasn't he? I think people were a bit embarrassed by the fact that Mickey Most really made his name doing those kind of big glam rock singles. Yeah,
that's not exactly Brian Eno. But that's there are producers who people say that about. There are producers who bands make their best work with, have their biggest hits with, and always say, "Oh, he didn't do anything." Well, he did something.
Yes.
Yeah.
As is apparent from your subsequent 5 albums.
Yes, absolutely. That's the truth. It can very often be the tiny thing, can't it, that makes the difference.
I think sometimes it's just when people think the producer isn't doing anything, what he's really doing is letting them work out things and listening.
Yeah.
And he might go on the talkback after an hour and go, "Hey, I really love what you're doing, but could you just not hit the cymbal? Just leave that out and just don't do anything right there." And, if you do that once a day, at the end of a month, you might have really, really affected a record without the musicians realizing how you had done it.
Yeah, I'm sure. It's like, I always think any form of kind of supervision or whatever, the best thing you'd ever do to people is say, "That's enough. That's fine."
Oh yeah. Take the painting away from the kid before they keep going.
Absolutely. So, Bill, it's traditional on these chats
Yes,
to ask people the impossible question: what is the greatest record ever made? Do you have an answer to that question?
I think we'd have to say that depending on which day of the week it is.
Right. Okay. Oh, it's
Either-
one of those.
Oh,
Okay.
lovely. You're covered.
It's
Right.
between Highway 61 and Asteroid. This is my original bought in 1968 Highway 61. This is my original bought, I guess, 1969 Astro Weeks. I mean, we'd have to say that Blonde on Blonde could also be in there, depending on your mood. But you know, I don't think you can get any better records than Highway 61 and Astro Weeks. I think you can have very
Thrilling
different
records. Also, there's something very exciting with Blonde on Blonde. Something very exciting about the idea that songs like "Sad Eyed Lady" were pretty much constructed on the day they were recorded, weren't they? And he went in, and I think he gave them the chords, and then he went off and got some bars of chocolate and some coffee, and frantically wrote the lyrics. They started recording at 2 a.m, did 3 takes, and that was it. And the song simply didn't exist early that afternoon. I find that absolutely thrilling.
Yeah, I mean, for better and occasionally for worse, Dylan has been like an action painter. He's wanted to capture something as it's happening.
Yeah,
it's a performance. You know, I thought the most revealing thing in Chronicles, his memoir, was, well, actually, let me think. You know what? I just had a real senior moment. I just had. Oh,
don't worry.
The most revealing thing in memoirs. I heard someone talking through the door. The most revealing thing in memoirs, in Chronicles, was that he talked about seeing the Clancy Brothers when he was very young, and seeing the power that came out of those Irish rebel songs, and it got him thinking about how to make a powerful presentation. And it doesn't take a lot of intuition to say that, well, from there, he thought he can't get up and sing, Irish Republican songs, but he could sing about civil rights. He could sing about masters of war. He could sing about, what was going on in his country in his time. And I think an awful lot of Dylan's work has been written as sort of dramatic monologue.
Yes.
Whether it's Idiot Wind or anything else, Dylan is I guess he's done everything once, but, it's very rare that he does a sort of heart on the sleeve, purely confessional song. It's almost always a presentation that is like something that if an actor got up in acting class and they said, all right, you got 5 minutes, do something that's going to knock us out. It would be something like Dylan writes. And I think that's something he does that a lot of other singer-songwriters don't do. I think he sort of makes sure that he's making a heroic statement.
Yeah, tell you the other thing that struck me, we were talking about this the other week when it was his 80th birthday, and I was saying that in the end, the thing I like most about Bob Dylan is the way he sings, which is the thing my father used to object to most, and traditionally people object to, but that's the thing I like most. And it struck me that one thing he doesn't get sufficient credit for is his diction is absolutely brilliant.
Yes, that's right. His diction is absolutely brilliant. His ability to do the sort of Chuck Berry long line.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you remember all the words, it goes into the back of your head. It's not just a noise,
No, it's not a noise. And it's the opposite in a way of Jagger or John Fogerty or something.
Yeah. Yes.
And in his later career, singing so brilliantly offbeat all the time.
Yeah.
Singing behind or ahead of the beat, just like a jazz singer. Fabulous.
Yes.
So what are you working on now, Bill? Or are you just staring out the window like the rest of us?
Well, I am staring out the window, but I'm doing these radio shows. I've been doing a series for Audible, which I guess is not available in the UK. So I'm sorry.
Well, it might be. Go on, tell us what it is.
They're basically audiobook memoirs with people like Sting and Sheryl Crow and Eddie Smokey Robinson, James Taylor. We've been doing them at a pretty good clip. I'm editing Eddie Vedder now, and
so you do the interviews.
Yeah, but they're not exactly interviews. It's more like it's a collaboration where we meet with the artist and say, "This is your story. It's your words. You're going to pick them," and I'm going to be more like a director, getting a performance out of it. No, actually, what I'm going to be is I'm going to be an editor working with a writer, but the artist is the writer. So we'll talk about topics. We'll start to make a map for it, and then we'll spend several sessions working our way through the stories until they're in a form that the author, that the artist is comfortable with. At the end of which we'll probably have, 6 hours,
Right,
rough,
I'm gonna say. Yeah.
which we then get down to about 90 minutes.
All right. Okay. Oh, very good. Very good.
It's called Words and Music. And
Words and Music. Well, then maybe they'll appear in the UK at some point.
I hope
in the
they do.
future.
Yeah.
Bill, it's been a delight catching up with you.
It's wonderful seeing you.
Lovely to
fellas.
talk to you. Really nice to talk to you. That was fantastic.
And who knows, when this bloody war is over, we may meet again geographically.
And we may start just flying on airplanes and going to restaurants.
Going to restaurants and ending up
And drinking beer,
Yes, drinking beer. That would be good.
as we did in Islington.
Good work, man.
Thank you.
Word in Your Attic, a Zoom with a View.